Blood ran through the streets. Families vanished overnight, and the world watched in silence. In 1965, Indonesia experienced one of the deadliest massacres of the 20th century, a government-backed genocide that killed at least 500,000 people. Some say it was necessary to prevent communism. Others call it one of the worst crimes in modern history. But there's one thing that cannot be denied. Someone was pulling the strings. Did the Indonesian government act alone? Or was there a much darker force at play? Declassified CIA documents suggest that the West may have been far more involved than they'll ever admit. What really happened during these mass killings? Who were the true masterminds? And why is the world still silent about it? To understand this horrifying event, we must start before the first body even fell. Indonesia, 1965. A country on the edge of disaster. President Sukarno, the founding father of modern Indonesia, was walking a dangerous tightrope. His nation was divided, unstable, and drowning in Cold War tensions. On one side, the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI, the third largest in the world, was rapidly gaining influence. On the other, the military and Western-backed elites saw communism as a direct threat to their power. The US and its allies had just witnessed the fall of China and the Korean War. They were terrified that Indonesia, one of the world's largest nations, would become the next domino to fall. But what if someone wanted that chaos to spiral out of control? What if this crisis wasn't just political instability, but a carefully planned operation? The stage was set for one of the most brutal purges in history. But it all began with a single night of bloodshed. September 30th, 1965. In Jakarta, the night air was thick with tension. That night, 6 Indonesian generals were kidnapped and executed by a group calling itself the 30th of September movement. Their bodies were dumped into a well, mutilated beyond recognition. The military immediately blamed the Indonesian Communist Party, PKI. The media exploded with horrific stories. Some claimed that communist women had tortured the generals before killing them. But was that the truth? There were 2 disturbing details that didn't add up. First, the PKI denied involvement. Second, some high-ranking officials had been mysteriously warned to stay away that night. Even more suspicious, General Suharto, who would later take over Indonesia, escaped unharmed. Was this really a failed communist coup? Or was this a false flag operation to justify mass killings? One thing was clear. The military had found its perfect excuse. And what followed was a massacre so brutal, history itself tried to forget it. Within days, the military launched one of the deadliest extermination campaigns of the Cold War. Entire villages were accused of harboring communists. Suspects were rounded up, beaten, and executed. Men, women, even children. No one was safe. But who were the real targets? Was this about eliminating communism, or something far more sinister? The victims weren't just Communist Party members. They were journalists, activists, teachers, and anyone the government deemed suspicious.
Saya akan memperkenalkan diri. Nama saya Bejo Untung. Saya lahir tanggal 14 Maret tahun 1948 di sebuah kota kecil Pemalang, Jawa Tengah, Indonesia. Pada awal Oktober 1965, ayah saya sudah terlebih dahulu ditahan. Semenjak saat itu, ayah sudah tidak ada lagi. Saya ditangkap 5 tahun sesudahnya, yaitu pada tahun 1970. Kemudian celana panjang, hanya tinggal kolor. Jari telunjuk ini diikat dengan lilitan kawat, ya, kemudian dihubungkan dengan strum listrik, dan strum itu diputar. Dan itu saya merasa saya terpukul bertubi-tubi. Kemudian torture atau penyiksaan. Orang-orang yang dituduh anggota Parti Komunis Indonesia maupun simpatisan Sukarno itu disiksa dalam bentuk di strum, dipukul, kemudian digantung, kemudian disilet-silet, ya, dipotong-potong, dan bahkan ada yang dipenggal.
And there was something even darker beneath the surface. Some of the most brutal killings weren't carried out by soldiers, but by ordinary civilians. The government encouraged neighbors to turn on neighbors, families to betray their own. Indonesia was drenched in blood, and the military had just begun its brutal purge. The bodies were piling up by the thousands. But behind the scenes, the killings were being carefully orchestrated. Recently declassified documents revealed that the CIA played a direct role in the mass purge. The US government saw Sukarno as a threat. His close ties to the Soviet Union and China made him a dangerous figure in Cold War politics. To stop Indonesia from turning communist, they needed Suharto to take power at any cost. And so, America provided the Indonesian military with weapons, money, and something even more chilling, hit lists. A US embassy official admitted that they handed over the names of suspected communists, knowing they would be executed. But it didn't stop there. The CIA also helped spread anti-communist propaganda, fueling public hysteria. The narrative was clear. Communists were murderers, traitors, and enemies of the nation. Anyone could be next. What the world didn't know was that some of these so-called communists weren't even political. They were just people in the wrong place at the wrong time. The West had ignited the fire. Now, Indonesia was about to explode into full-scale genocide. The scale of the slaughter was unimaginable. 500,000 dead? 1 million? Some historians believe the real number could be even higher. But the most terrifying part? The methods used to kill. The executions weren't just about death. They were about sending a message. Victims were tortured in the most horrific ways. Dismembered, burned alive, or drowned in rivers stained red with blood. In some regions, militias were given full control. They turned murder into sport, competing to see who could kill the most. And the most shocking detail? Many of these killers were never punished. Some later bragged about their crimes, laughing about how easy it was to get away with mass murder. But there was another side to this story, one that's even more disturbing. Because while the world turned a blind eye to the genocide, some saw it as a victory. Indonesia had cleansed itself of communism, and the world's most powerful nations were celebrating. As the bodies were buried in mass graves, something even more sinister was happening. The world knew, but no one cared. The United Nations? Silent. The US and Britain? Not only did they ignore the genocide, they celebrated it. Western newspapers called it a great victory against communism. American and British officials congratulated Indonesia's new military leaders, ignoring the atrocities they had just committed. And there was a reason for this silence: business. With communists wiped out, Indonesia was now open for business. Western corporations rushed in, striking deals with Suharto's new regime. Natural resources, oil, and infrastructure were suddenly up for grabs. Indonesia had been purified in blood, and now the West was cashing in. But the story wasn't over. Because while the killings had stopped, the scars ran deep. And the dictatorship that rose from this bloodshed would rule Indonesia for decades. The genocide had done its job. Suharto was now the most powerful man in Indonesia. Sukarno, the father of the nation, was pushed aside, his authority shattered. Under house arrest, he watched as the country he built was turned into a dictatorship. But Suharto didn't just take power. He made sure it was absolute. Opposition? Eliminated. Dissent? Crushed. Communism? Outlawed forever. For over 30 years, Suharto ruled with an iron fist. He was Indonesia's smiling general, always appearing calm and collected. But behind closed doors, he was a brutal tyrant. Political prisoners rotted in jail for decades. Secret police hunted down anyone who spoke against him. And yet, the West welcomed him with open arms. He was their man. The same nations that condemned dictatorship elsewhere were now funding one in Indonesia. But even dictators can't rule forever. And when Suharto finally fell, the ghosts of his past would come back to haunt Indonesia. Decades passed, but the wounds of 1965 never healed. For many Indonesians, the genocide wasn't just history, it was a shadow that followed them. Some survivors were forced into exile. Others spent their entire lives being treated as traitors. Their families were blacklisted, denied jobs, and silenced. But in the 2000s, a new movement began. People started speaking out. Journalists, filmmakers, and historians dug up the truth that the government had buried. Survivors came forward with horrifying testimonies. For the first time, the world saw the human cost of Indonesia's darkest chapter. And then, something unthinkable happened. Some of the killers, the men who carried out the massacres, also started talking. But they didn't show remorse. They bragged. This was the moment when Indonesia's past could no longer be ignored. But if justice was finally within reach, why did the government still refuse to acknowledge the genocide? Indonesia's government had a clear message: there was no genocide. To this day, the 1965 mass killings are barely mentioned in history books. Schools teach a version of events that paints the military as heroes, not murderers. Survivors who speak out are still threatened. And Suharto's influence? It never really disappeared. Even after his fall in 1998, many of his allies remained in power. Some of the same families who profited from the bloodshed still control Indonesia's politics today. But why is the government so desperate to hide the truth? What are they afraid of? There's one possibility that terrifies them. If they admit the truth, they might have to admit guilt. And guilt could mean justice. But with so much at stake, can Indonesia ever truly confront its past? Or will this massacre remain buried forever? Justice was supposed to come after Suharto's fall. But more than 20 years later, the victims are still waiting. Attempts to investigate the genocide have been blocked. Survivors who try to file lawsuits face intimidation. And when the Indonesian president was asked to apologize, he refused. But why? Why is Indonesia so afraid of the truth? One reason is simple. If justice happens, powerful people could fall. Some of the officials, military leaders, and businessmen who gained wealth and power in 1965 are still in control today. And then there's the international problem. If the genocide is fully exposed, what would it mean for the US, Britain, and Australia? Could they also be held accountable? Could world powers face consequences for their role in mass murder? Indonesia isn't the only one running from justice. The entire world is. But history has a way of catching up. And one single event could change everything. What if history repeats itself? What if Indonesia is still walking on the edge of another massacre? The signs are there. Militias still operate in secret. Radical groups still believe in political purges. And in recent years, Indonesia has seen a rise in authoritarianism once again. Censorship is increasing. Journalists exposing past crimes face death threats. Government critics disappear. And nationalist groups still chant the same slogans that fueled the 1965 purge. Even more disturbing, some of Suharto's former allies are gaining power again. There are whispers that if the political climate shifts, violence could return. Could the ghosts of 1965 rise again? Or has Indonesia truly learned from its past? There's a reason Indonesia wants you to forget. Because the truth is even darker than what's been revealed. What if the 1965 purge wasn't just about communism? What if it was about something much bigger? Some historians believe the killings weren't just political, they were economic. Elites used the purge to eliminate rivals, seize land, and strengthen their own power. The genocide wasn't just ideological, it was a brutal power grab. And then there are the deeper secrets. What happened to the missing bodies? Why were some massacres covered up more than others? Were there mass graves that have never been found? The story of 1965 isn't over. Because if there are still secrets waiting to be uncovered, then the horror might not be buried after all. The world has spent decades trying to bury 1965. But the dead don't stay silent forever. No government can suppress history forever. Documents will be leaked. Survivors will keep speaking. New generations will demand answers. The only question left is, will Indonesia face the truth before it's too late? Because justice delayed is justice denied. The story of 1965 isn't just about Indonesia. It's a warning. Because history shows us something chilling. The most terrifying crimes don't happen in secret. They happen in plain sight, with the world watching, and doing nothing. Could something like this happen again? Has the world really learned its lesson? Or will another country become the next Indonesia? There are so many hidden genocides, so many massacres that history refuses to talk about. But here at the Great Chronicles, we uncover what they don't want you to know. So subscribe, because the next forgotten atrocity we expose might be even more terrifying than this one.